Learning Chinese is more like walking 1,000 miles than running a 100-meter dash, so make sure that your strategy works in the long term. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about metaphors and analogies for learning Chinese and see what they have to tell us about how to learn the language. Before we get into that, I'd like to mention that this month's listening challenge starts on May 10th, so it's not too late if you haven't enrolled yet, and indeed you can enroll even if you listen to this after the 10th. If you listen much later though, you can head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com to see what challenge is on when you're listening. All these challenges are completely free to join, and they are just meant to encourage you to spend more time learning and get closer to your goals. So let's use this as a segue into this week's topic, which is related to goals and destinations. And one of the most commonly used metaphors for learning something is that of a journey, where we map progress to movement in space. So you are at point A now, you want to get to point B, and then there is a certain distance you have to travel to get there. You move forward, you run into obstacles in your path, you work your way around them, and then you get closer to your goal, which is then a destination you are traveling towards. I think that overall this analogy is rather useful, and I use it a lot myself when I talk about learning Chinese in terms of goals, what you need to do, and things like that. But I also think that there's room for lots of misconceptions when it comes to this kind of analogy, and more specifically, I think that scale matters. So in this episode, I want to compare two different versions of this analogy. One of them would be to say that learning Chinese is like walking 1,000 miles, and the other one would be to say that it's like running a 100-meter dash. Now, I don't think that many of you listeners think that learning Chinese is exactly like one of these activities, and if we were to imagine a spectrum with a 1,000-mile journey on the one end and then a 100-meter dash on the other, maybe we would all place somewhere in between these, and probably most of us would put ourselves closer to the 1,000-mile journey end than the 100-meter dash end. In this episode, I want to discuss the difference between these two analogies and what they can tell us as learners of Chinese and how we should approach learning the language. I'm going to focus on three key differences that I think make a big difference for us learners when we choose approach and strategy and so on. So the first difference is that scale is different by several orders of magnitude, so strategies that will work for running 100 meters or traveling a short distance will not necessarily work, or at least not work as well, if you want to travel a long distance. And this is true for both running and walking, and it's also true for learning Chinese. The second difference is that in 100-meter dash, there's a direct straight path to the finish line and it's on flat ground, whereas if you're on a 1,000-mile journey, this is rarely the case. And as we shall see, of course, when learning Chinese, this is rarely a straightforward activity where you know exactly what to do and you already see the goal when you're starting. Indeed, we might not even start at the same place, and we certainly don't end up in the same place either. Many people also change their goals for learning Chinese along the way, which is not really a good idea if you're running 100-meter dash. The third difference is that learning Chinese is not a race against other learners. It is not a competition. Even though I sometimes say that friendly competition is a nice thing in hacking Chinese challenges, for example, this is just meant to be a motivational boost. It is not actually a competition where it matters who gets first. What matters is what you do and how this matches up to your expectations and your goals for learning Chinese. So let's talk about these three differences in a little bit more detail, starting with the difference in scale. So the road to mastering Chinese is long, and of course I've given completely arbitrary numbers here with 100 meters versus 1,000 miles, but the point is that it is a long distance and it will take time to travel. Of course, you can still make great progress in a few months or a year if you study diligently, but if you want to reach an advanced level, it's going to take much longer than that, and this is of course doubly so if you are studying part-time. This means that you need to evaluate learning strategies that you are considering, both in the short term and in the long term. And if something just works in the short term, meaning that it allows you to do what you want to do today or this week, but they don't work in the long term, for example because you think they are boring or they drain your energy in some other way, then they aren't really viable strategies, because learning Chinese is a long-term project. In other words, your approach needs to be not only effective at teaching you Chinese, it also needs to be sustainable. And it goes without saying that, of course, you don't need to use the same method for learning Chinese year after year, and indeed, maybe the key to sustainable learning is to do different things and mix up your learning in various ways. The point here is that you should think of learning Chinese as a long-term project, as a 1,000-mile journey, not a 100-meter dash. So here are 3 insights from looking at learning Chinese in this fashion. So the first one is that how you start doesn't matter. The point is that you're moving. In 100-meter dash, it is extremely important, of course, how you start, because that might determine the whole race. But if you're walking 100 miles, it doesn't really matter how you take your first step, if you use precisely the correct technique and whatnot. The important thing is that you started on your journey and you keep taking steps. This is definitely true for learning Chinese. You will not find the perfect method immediately. It depends on so many things, what you like, what you prefer, what you're good at, and the situation you're in, and so on. So this will be a bit trial and error. You need to try things, you need to evaluate them and see what works for you. So don't expect your method to be perfect when you start out, and if you spend too much time thinking about what method you're using, you're wasting time that you could have used learning Chinese instead, even with an imperfect method. The second one is that your average pace matters much more than your top speed. So if you were to run 100 meters as quickly as you can, of course it is very important that your top speed is high. That kind of determines how quickly you will finish the race. You can keep this high speed until you reach the finish line and then you're done. This is not the same as when walking 1,000 miles though, because then your top speed is almost irrelevant and your average speed is what matters. For example, when you're out on your 1,000-mile journey and you suddenly sprint 100 meters in 10 seconds, this has almost no impact at all on your overall travel distance, and indeed it probably has a negative impact because you will get very tired and you might have to rest. A human can easily outrun a cheetah over longer distances because while they run very fast, they also get tired very easily. So it's desirable here to be the human and not the big cat. Observation number 3 is that motivation is more important the farther you need to go. So if you're reasonably healthy, running 100 meters requires nothing in terms of motivation except the willingness to try. Even when running longer distances, and I quite like running, so for example when I try to run 10 kilometers as fast as I can, it does require a lot of motivation, because it is rather easy to give up after half the distance and just quit, because to be honest, running 10k as quickly as you can is not very pleasurable. Then if we increase the distance to 1,000 miles, then motivation becomes all important, because if you don't have a reason to keep walking, you will stop at some point. Maybe you'll get distracted by some of the pretty things scattered along the road, or you might change direction and decide to do something differently. And that might be fine, but it will not teach you Chinese, which is what we're talking about here. So these were 3 observations about the scale, i.e. the distance we're traveling. And it makes a difference if it's 100 meters or 1,000 miles. We use different approaches and they have different effects on our traveling. Many people, and I think maybe especially those who haven't started learning Chinese or have only been doing it for a short time, think that Chinese is difficult because each step is hard. They have maybe seen characters or tones and they realize, wow, this seems very difficult, every step is a challenge. But if you've been learning Chinese for a while, you have probably realized that actually this is not the problem, because each step is not that hard, but the problem is that there are so many steps. This is something I discussed in an article called Is Chinese Difficult to Learn? And I have put a link to that in the description if you want to hear my take on this question that I get asked all the time. So let's move on to the second part where I want to talk about the second difference, i.e. that learning Chinese is not like 100-meter dash in that there is no straight line from start to finish that is clearly plotted out in front of you. This is actually true for other races too, not just 100-meter dash of course, because even if you're running an ultramarathon, usually there's a specific road you should take from start to finish. Whereas if you're learning Chinese, as I've said before, we all start in different locations and our destinations are definitely different. And like I also said earlier, you might change your idea about what your destination should be along the way, and that is fine. This doesn't mean that there aren't things that look like paths to success though. For example, many students treat the HSK as a kind of roadmap to learning Chinese, which it totally isn't. This is something we covered in a recent podcast episode, namely number 129, so I will not dwell on this topic here. So, exploring yourself and finding your way forward, including determining where you want to go, is not necessarily a bad thing, even though I know that many students crave a clearly blazed trail towards their goal. However, you are the one learning the language, you should be in charge, and as I argued in episode 108, if you leave this to someone else, you will suffer the consequences someday. Being in charge yourself might sound a little bit scary, but if you think of this as exploring a foreign and exotic landscape, then choosing what to do and how to do it yourself doesn't sound like such a bad idea. There are two solutions to this problem, or rather two categories of solutions, and the first one is to figure out where you want to go. And some of you who listen, you know very well why you are learning Chinese and you have a very clear idea of your motivations. But many might not be. I know when I started learning Chinese, I just wanted to try it out, and that is completely fine. But being clear about why you are learning Chinese and what you want to do with the Chinese you learn can be a significant boost to your motivation. It will also inform choices about how you're learning Chinese, because some things are more important when you want to do certain things with Chinese as compared to other things. The second part of the solution is to figure out how to get from where you are now to where you want to be, your destination. This is trickier to discuss because obviously there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution here that I can just say that will magically allow you to reach your goals. And in one sense, you can think of Hacking Chinese as being my attempt at answering this question. And so far, I've written way more than 400 articles, and I have a lot yet to write. So my suggestion is that when you know where you are going and what you need to get there, and you run into some kind of problem, you head over to Hacking Chinese, and if you're on a desktop computer, you check the sidebar for the category links, or if you're on mobile, you will find this in the footer. And there I have pages that are dedicated to specific areas of learning Chinese, such as listening or vocabulary or something else. And there you will find an overview of that topic, along with all the articles that I've written that are related to that area. Goal setting and plotting a path from where you are now to where you want to be is also covered in my course, Hacking Chinese, a practical guide to learning Mandarin. And as usual, I will put links to these things in the description of this episode. So let's turn to the third and final difference between a 100-meter dash and a 1,000-mile journey, namely that one is a competition and the other is not. So, like I said earlier, even though friendly competition can sometimes be helpful, learning Chinese is not a race. While I do believe and certainly hope that most listeners don't think of it as a race, if you read about learning Chinese on social media, discussion fora, and so on, you can get the impression sometimes that many people actually do think that it is a race. If you don't reach a certain milestone in a certain time, you're a bad learner, or look at me, I passed HSK 5 in a year, and so on. The most destructive version of regarding Chinese as a race is when you envy other people for their achievements, or the absolutely worst thing is when you think that somebody else performing badly somehow makes your performance better. Why share notes from yesterday's lesson if withholding them can give you an advantage over your classmates, for example? This is clearly nonsense, but it is something that I have encountered several times. Personally, I would say that one of my main strengths is that I don't like competing with other people. I don't view what I do in terms of what other people do, and that I think is more healthy in the long run. Also, if we were to compete when it comes to learning Chinese, what does matter is efficiency, not how fast you do things, because that is of course closely tied to how much time you spend, and as we all know, we have different amounts of time available for learning Chinese. This difference between efficiency and speed was something I explored in episode 124 if you want to learn more about that. Still, I don't think that most learners incorporate competition into their long-term goals for learning Chinese. So, for example, learning the language to outshine your brother or to show your classmate that you're smarter than she is might work for short-term learning in middle school, but it would be a little bit bizarre to include in your long-term goal for learning Chinese as an adult. This means that the only competition you should engage in seriously is with yourself. Challenge yourself and use new methods and see if they work better than the others. See if you can spend more time listening in this month's listening challenge compared to the previous one, and make it your goal to keep moving and improve relative to your past performance, not somebody else. Another thing to keep in mind is that since you are not competing against other learners, enlisting them for help is a good idea. If we return to the travel through space is learning analogy, then running with other people is easier and you can rely on other people's motivation when yours is flagging. And for example, if you're into cycling, you know that if you're cycling in a group, everybody benefits. Everybody gets to spend a little bit less energy to get the same distance. This is something I wrote more about in an article called You Shouldn't Walk the Road to Chinese Fluency Alone, and again, link in the description. This brings us to the conclusion of this episode, even though I do suspect that there are many insights related to the metaphors I've used here that I haven't covered, but we have to stop somewhere. I think it should be clear by now that learning Chinese is a long-term project, much more akin to walking 1,000 miles than it is a short-term project like running 100-meter dash. The mindset and the strategies required to succeed in a short-term project and a long-term project are of course different, and so the point of recording this episode is to help you lift your gaze from the short-term learning and look towards the long-term. Are you treating learning Chinese as the 1,000-mile journey it is? Is your learning method sustainable? Are you paying enough attention to motivation? And are you avoiding all the other traps that you can fall into if you incorrectly think that learning Chinese is like running a 100-meter dash? Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.